Good evening. So a couple of weeks ago, we then concluded looking at the presentation on the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And we concluded with looking at the section, the measure of its development. In other words, the arisal of the mind that is the result of training, engaging in the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And that is the mind of definite emergence or renunciation. This mind of definite emergence arises in dependence on reflecting on the sufferings of samsara in detail, coming to recognize how samsara is pervaded by suffering. And in building on that, looking at the causes of the sufferings of samsara. In other words, true sufferings and true origins. So through reflecting deeply and repeatedly over a sustained period on true sufferings and true origins, the mind comes that is definite, certain about emerging from the suffering realms of samsara. So this attitude of definite emergence, which is the measure of having trained successfully in the practices which are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, is that this mind is something that arises in a manner that's uncontrived or spontaneous. In other words, it's always influencing us in how we relate to what we are experiencing. We are always aware of whether our mind is creating the causes for suffering or creating the causes for happiness. And this is an ever-present awareness of our mind. And the awareness of the mind in the sense of ensuring it's not under the influence of the afflictions, but is rather creating the causes for liberation from suffering. And the analogy given in the second verse on page 178 is that of even if a person who is trapped in a house that is ablaze, they will not be distracted from their mind in that circumstance. In other words, whilst being trapped in a house that's ablaze, and of course wanting to seek freedom from this burning house, the person will still be aware of their mind and ensuring it is not afflicted, but rather is a virtuous mind. When this way of thinking is stable or uncontrived, then one has achieved the trainings or the fruit of the training shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. So in these reflections on true sufferings and true origins that give rise to the mind of definite emergence, one also needs to come to recognize that there is nothing to be found within samsara that has any abiding value. So this is also required to actually give rise to definite emergence. And this comes about, this recognition that there is nothing of abiding value to be found in samsara through reflecting on true sufferings and true origins. And there are different ways to engage in this reflection. The threefold, the sixfold, the eightfold presentation of suffering, as well as the sufferings or the individual realms, those that humans experience, those at the various levels of God's experience, those in the lower realms such as animals experience. Coming to recognize there's nothing worthy of striving for that has come about independence on contaminated karma. In other words, there's nothing with abiding value in samsara. This too is a prerequisite for the generation of definite emergence. And with this attitude, this mind of definite emergence, one is clear that all that matters is that I gain freedom, that I gain my liberation from samsara. This needs to be my overriding objective in life. So let's return to the text. And we're going to start at the paragraph where last time we concluded in the middle of the paragraph, but we'll restart at the beginning. So it's page 178, under the measure of its development, the second paragraph. And again, I had changed the translation a little bit, added what was omitted. As Shoah taught, if this attitude is no more than mediocre, like flour poured into inferior beer, forming a thin layer on the surface, the view that rejects the causes of cyclic existence, the origins, will also not become more than that. So if one's home brew is a bit weak, is a bit light, then to give it a little bit more sustenance, then traditionally one would add some tsongkhapa to that, and mix it in to make it a bit thicker. But if one only adds a little bit of tsongkhapa to this home brew, and then it will still stay light and not having much taste. It won't be nutritious, it won't be appealing, it won't have the desired effect. And that then is the meaning of the illustration, which here the analogy works that if one hasn't reflected well on true sufferings, one is not going to have reflected so well on true origins, which is the meaning here of the word the origin. So the origins of the sufferings of samsara. So if one has not really come to recognize that each and every suffering experience comes about in dependence on karma that was contaminated by the presence of the afflictions, both in the accumulation of the karma and in the ripening of it. Without recognizing this, then one's mind of definite emergence is going to be superficial at best. It will just be like, which wasn't in our translation, but this line that was missed, inferior beer forming a thin layer on the surface. So there's just a little bit of tsongkhapa. It's too little that has been added to the beer. It is now just forming a layer on top. It hasn't mixed. It's not enough to have mixed with the liquid and making it thick and enjoyable. Similarly, if one hasn't reflected well on how suffering comes about in dependence on contaminated karma and principally the afflictions, one's mind of definite emergence will be superficial. So don't imagine that you can relate directly to home brewing and certainly not mixing it with tsongkhapa, but it would be like going to a coffee shop and getting a coffee and it hasn't been made properly. The milk hasn't been foamed well and the coffee is just, the milk and the coffee is just runny. You can drink it, but it's not going to be satisfying at all. It's not going to serve its purpose. So likewise here with the reflection not being done sufficiently, not being done deeply, so it changes, transforms one's mind. So if one has heard these teachings, read the text, done some reflection, but one's mind, one's way of thinking remains untransformed, one may sometimes gain some recognition of suffering and its origins, but it's sporadic. It has some kind of partial impact on one's mind. One's mind will remain untransformed. One's way of thinking is untransformed. And this then, to return to the analogy, it's like if one gets in the coffee shop a coffee that's quite weak and runny and the milk hasn't formed properly. So the barista just covers it with a lot of chocolate and you look at it and think, oh, it looks quite good. But you taste it and it's unsatisfying. Likewise, not having reflected sufficiently, repeatedly over a sustained period, one will have some superficial understanding, but one's mind remains untransformed. And furthermore, from the text, accordingly, one striving for liberation, the cessation that is the ceasing of sufferings and origins, will be the same. So just read the sentence again. Accordingly, one striving for liberation, the cessation that is the ceasing of sufferings and origins will be the same. So here we see the word liberation. Then immediately after follows the meaning of what is liberation. Liberation, which is the liberation from samsara, or the liberations from the sufferings of samsara, is explained as a cessation that is the ceasing of sufferings and its origins. So in other words, what is liberation? Is when the origins of suffering have ceased, and therefore sufferings themselves can never be experienced. Origins, it can be expressed as causes. So when the causes for suffering have ceased, then the result of those causes, suffering itself, will never be experienced. One is liberated from the result of those causes, namely suffering. This is the meaning of liberation. Liberation from the sufferings of samsara. And the first word there, accordingly, so this links to the previous sentence, which means if we haven't come to deeply understand how there are true sufferings, which is that there is nothing of abiding value in samsara, anything that any being can experience within samsara is still subject to suffering because of its causes. So without understanding true sufferings well, one will not have come to recognize the origins of suffering well, and therefore, as it says later in the sentence, the desire to attain their complete pacification, and the desire to attain their complete pacification arises. So if one has not reflected well on true sufferings and origins, one's wish for liberation just will be weak and superficial. So liberation is the cessation of suffering. It comes about through abandoning the afflictions together with their seeds, because those are the origins of suffering. And the mind that is striving to attain liberation, which is the abandonment or the afflictions together with their seeds, is the mind striving for liberation. And whether that mind has arisen or not depends on the transformation of the mind that has come about through reflecting deeply over a sustained period on true sufferings and true origins. So it's through reflecting on true sufferings and true origins deeply over a sustained period that one's mind will transform and give rise to the determined attitude striving for liberation from suffering. If one does not give rise to a strong mind that is striving for liberation, then, and continuing from the text, because of that, the desire to accomplish the path of liberation will be mere words. So the sentence then, because of that, so because of not having this underlying motivation behind all that we say, do, and think, this determined attitude striving for liberation, lacking that, the desire to accomplish the path of liberation, to cultivate the path of liberation within one's own mind, will be mere words. The mind will not be transformed. So this is a really important point, because you've once heard these teachings, probably for most of you, many times. So one has an understanding of suffering and its origins. But in dependence on what one has heard and the reflection one has engaged in based on that, to that proportion, the mind striving for liberation will arise. If one has gathered a lot of knowledge and engaged in extensive repeated reflection on that knowledge, then proportionately the mind striving for liberation will arise. If one's knowledge and reflection remains partial or remains weak, then one's determined attitude striving for liberation will be partial, will be weak. But if one has heard many teachings and reflected well over a sustained period, proportionately, one's determined attitudes to gain liberation will be dominant within. If we think of the situation of anyone who emigrates, they will have looked with clear eyes at their situation in their current residence, and they would have looked perhaps at their safety there, at their economic prospects, and they would have come to a recognition perhaps that there is no future for them here. And if that's as far as they had seen, they would have been quite unhappy, would have felt probably quite helpless and no hope in their future. But if they had come to hear about somewhere else where there is safety and there is the possibility of economic prosperity, then their hope would have risen. They'd think, that's where I'd want to be. Is it possible for me? And then they would have investigated. And when they come to recognize it is possible, there are various causes that need to be accumulated. But when those causes are accumulated, you can attain a life of safety and potential economic prosperity. That giving rise to a wish to transform one's life by emigrating and moving elsewhere. If that is just a wish, a dream, no change will come. So it'll be a dream one holds on to, but no change will come. But if one has truly come to recognize there is no future where I am now, I'm in danger, there is no economic future where I live either, then one will make more efforts to investigate about leaving and strive to achieve those causes. And if one's determination is so strong, one will even go through a number of hardships, not just in gathering the causes, but in fleeing. And we see this certainly in the case of refugees, where they may flee in rickety boats or by other means. What we see here is that someone has reflected and come to see clearly where they are. They've recognized it doesn't have to be this way. There is another possibility. And that has led them to seek out what those causes are, to gain better prospects, and they have accomplished those causes. And any hardships that they have to endure, they will do so because they recognize the possibility of a life transformed. So this is something that we see in our world. Perhaps some of you have experienced this or know people who have. How it relates here, though, should be clear. That first, through recognizing the sufferings of samsara and recognizing thereby there is nothing of abiding value to be hoped for, to be longed for, to strive for within samsara. There is no birth that is free from suffering. There's no experience that is completely free from suffering as long as one is still bound in samsara. And from that recognition of true sufferings, one has looked at true origins clearly and recognized what those origins are and that it is within my capacity to abandon them. One will then, having reflected well on true sufferings and true origins, will give rise to a determined attitude to gain liberation from suffering, to strive for liberation from suffering. And this will be experienced then as being the overriding objective of one's life. All the various tasks and things that we need to do will be experienced through the lens of, I'm not accumulating the causes for suffering, but I am the causes for liberation. And in this way, whatever hardships one encounters, whatever challenges one encounters, one will be able to deal with them, transform them. Likewise, with one's habitual tendencies, pulling one back to one's afflictions. One will be able to skillfully keep applying antidotes. So there's a proportional relationship between the strength of the wish for liberation and the effort to attain that liberation. If the wish for liberation is slight, one will express mere words of wanting liberation. But if one has transformed one's way of thinking and has a deep, abiding, determined attitude for liberation, that is where one will place all one's attention and effort. Then the sentence continues. There will be no basis for the compassion that cannot bear the suffering of other beings who wander in cyclic existence. So I'll read in English the whole sentence together. The Tibetan doesn't divide the sentence like this, but it makes it clearer. Because of that, the desire to accomplish the path of liberation will be mere words, and also there will be no basis for the compassion that cannot bear the suffering of other beings who wander in cyclic existence. Here, this points to the mind of definite emergence, or the determined attitude to strive for liberation. That mind is the foundation, the indispensable foundation to give rise to actual compassion. Because what is meant by compassion is for those to whom the compassion is directed, to gain liberation from the sufferings of samsara through abandoning the causes of that suffering. And if one has not given rise to this yearning for oneself to gain freedom from suffering through abandoning the origins of suffering, if one hasn't given rise to that wish in relation to oneself, one is not going to in relation to others. So again, so here too, just like in the previous segment, the first half of the sentence, there is a proportional relationship between the strength of definite emergence, which is in relation to oneself, and the strength of genuine compassion for others that can thereafter be generated. Generate compassion. One recognizes that no being wants to suffer, not myself, not any other being. No one wants to suffer even slightly, let alone in an intense manner. So to be able to actually recognize that, one needs to understand what is meant by suffering, and not have a mere understanding of suffering, but to see how it pervades samsara. Because without recognizing how it pervades samsara, one will think there is something to hope for in samsara and will long for that for oneself or others. And thereby, one's compassion will be flawed because one's own wish for freedom from suffering hasn't yet been generated because one hasn't come to recognize how suffering pervades samsara. Without that prior understanding, then the reflection on the causes of suffering will also be insufficient and incomplete. But when one has reflected deeply on suffering and its origins in relation to oneself and given rise to a determined attitude to gain freedom, then that one can easily relate that to others or apply it to others. But if one has not done so towards oneself and one's understanding remains merely superficial, one's compassion towards others will not come about. The text continues. Since unsurpassed, uncontrived bodhicitta, which has the power to arouse the mind, will not arise. So I'll read it again. Since unsurpassed, uncontrived bodhicitta, which has the power to arouse the mind, will not arise. So without having generated transformative definite emergence, one will not give rise to great compassion. And without great compassion, uncontrived bodhicitta cannot arise. It cannot arise. Bodhicitta is the determined attitude to lead all beings to a state freed of suffering, and to do so by becoming a Buddha. That will not arise if one hasn't given rise to great compassion, and that cannot arise, great compassion, without definite emergence, the determination to lead oneself to gain freedom from suffering. This term uncontrived, as in uncontrived bodhicitta. So uncontrived means, well, it's clearer without the negative. So contrived bodhicitta is when one intentionally generates the mind of bodhicitta. So it's contrived or manufactured, created. So this, facsimiles of these certainly can be generated. Compassion can arise for some, wanting them to be free from suffering. But such experiences of compassion, and even when it is actual bodhicitta, but still contrived, it will always fade. It will come and it will go. It will not last. So therefore, the goal is to generate not just bodhicitta, but uncontrived bodhicitta. Bodhicitta that sustains itself. Bodhicitta that is so, bodhicitta that is so integrated within the practitioner that it sustains itself. It is their very way of being. Hence, they'll be suitable to be called a bodhisattva. So, I'll read in the whole sentence, again, I continued. Since unsurpassed, uncontrived bodhicitta, which has the power to arouse the mind, will not arise, you become a Mahayanist only in the way your understanding follows from words. In other words, by hearing words, hearing teachings, reading a text, seeing words, then compassion can arise. the wish to become a bodhisattva, to generate bodhicitta, will arise. But that understanding is very far from being uncontrived. It is contrived. It is dependent on making efforts. Another way to express it, which is a little clearer, is that one's calling oneself a Mahayanist will be mere words. It'll just be saying these words, calling yourself something that actually refers to a quality that some level you aspire for, but you haven't generated. So this is the meaning here of your understanding follows from mere words. You're calling yourself something, but that quality that is describing is far from actually being generated. Then the final sentence, for that reason, you should cultivate that attitude again and again. So that attitude refers to not bodhicitta, but this section that is concluding here, the meditations on true sufferings and true origins. This is what one should be reflecting on at all times. And again, as has been said in many times, in all contexts of meditation, in all contexts of the Dharma, topics of the Dharma, one doesn't only cultivate them in meditation, but also in keeping them at the forefront of one's mind in one's daily activities. So therefore, in this context, you're thinking about true sufferings and origins wherever you are, whatever you are doing. And in this way, slowly you'll come to recognize that suffering is everywhere, pervading everyone at all times. And that then is the meaning of, for that reason, you should cultivate that attitude again and again. So there is a sequence that leads to the generation of uncontrived bodhicitta. And in the context of what we're looking at here, you meditate on true sufferings. And as one's mind opens to the pervasiveness of suffering, one looks at the origins of suffering, the causes for it. These two together, true sufferings, true origins, leads to the generation of definite emergence, the determined attitude to strive for liberation from samsara. That then is in relation to oneself and applies that understanding then to all beings and generates actual great compassion, the indispensable prerequisite for bodhicitta itself. So this is the sequence of trainings that one has to engage in to become a bodhisattva. But here, what we just looked at, it acts as a mirror to our own mind. This is part of the function of the Dharma. By receiving teachings, reading texts, and relating to them as personal instructions for myself, we relate to them as a mirror to show the qualities of our mind. And in this case, how close am I to generating these qualities within myself? So in the same way, in the morning, when we get up, we may be looking at the mirror and have a look at our face and see, is it clean or not? Likewise, when we look at the text of the Dharma, we can be reminded of what is possible. And at the same time, look at where we are, and from this, take inspiration to strive more. For myself, sitting here in front of you, I have the same text, I read it, and I utilize it as a mirror in relation to my own mind. And so, if we look at a sentence just a little further up in the paragraph, something we looked at earlier tonight, because of that, the desire to accomplish the path of liberation will be mere words. So, if I'm honest about myself, this sentence really strikes home. If I look at myself and where my mind goes, I see that my mind is all too often concerned about the various activities that have to sustain myself, for example, cooking and so forth, as well as wanting some entertainment, like chatting to my friends and so forth. And so when reading this text and looking at my own mind, using it as a mirror in relation to my own mind, I can see I'm still drawn to the delights of samsara. And this shows, at the start of the sentence, that because of that, I've yet to come to recognize that there is nothing of any abiding value in samsara. I still am drawn to the delights of the sense pleasures like delicious food and the delights of having a chatting with my friends. I see this as I relate to this as I'm in a way that it draws me into it, and I follow this attachment drawn into it, as opposed to the type of practitioner is described here, the ideal to strive for, which is someone who has as their sole priority the attainment of liberation. That is their priority. And everything else that needs to be done, like sustaining of the body, speaking and interacting with others, is done through the lens of what has value is gaining liberation. And these other temporary things that I need to do are done so as to ensure the attainment of my liberation. So therefore, I read this and I see I too need to reflect more deeply here. So what we've seen here in this paragraph that we've looked at tonight is, and what I really hope has come across clearly, is how the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, the section that is being completed, is the indispensable foundation for developing great compassion. It is the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity is the indispensable preliminary practice to become a bodhisattva. So therefore, these trainings that we have been looking at here are the very preliminary practices one needs to engage in order to become a bodhisattva. So if in teachings you've heard about bodhisattvas and heard about bodhicitta and you have given rise to a wish to become such a remarkable being, this is what you need to train in. And this hopefully now is clear why this preliminary practice is indispensable. And this is therefore the reason why the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity precedes what will follow in the very next chapter, which are the trainings which are unique to practitioners of greatest capacity. So the Lamrim, as we've been seeing, is divided into three general sets of trainings in relation to the capacity of the practitioner. What we're concluding is the middle part for the trainings which are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, and as has been presented, is soon to be followed by the trainings which are unique to practitioner of greatest capacity. And the text started with looking at the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. So those trainings were the foundational preliminaries to get us to this point here, whereby we start to recognize the value of what we've achieved and to recognize that what we've achieved in this life is impermanent, it will not last, and it is also not something commonplace or ordinary. And thereafter we came to recognize that when death comes, it will be in one of two directions, depending on the causes created, either a rebirth, an excellent rebirth such as this, or falling into the lower realms. And there, when we came to look at the sufferings of the lower realms, the very purpose there was to give rise to the wish for liberation from the possibility of rebirth in the lower realms in our next life. So we looked at the sufferings of animals, of spirits, and of hell beings. And of the three, the sufferings of animals are the easiest to take to heart because we can recognize them, we can see them, we can hear them. By reflecting on how animals are suffering and recognizing how horrendous it would be that when this life ends, the karma that determines my next rebirth lead to my consciousness abiding in such a form of an animal, where my mind will be dominated by fear from becoming the food of a larger predator, being attacked by a rival, needing to compete for sustenance at all times. This is the lived experience of countless animals. Reflecting this way, one gives rise to a wish for liberation from such a rebirth, recognizes the causes that lead to such a rebirth and the causes that lead to an excellent rebirth such as we've achieved, and thereby strives to accumulate causes for excellent rebirths. That way of thinking has now, from the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, has been built on here, in the training shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. In the same way, one recognized the suffering of the lower realms and gave rise to a wish to be liberated from them, and strove in the causes to gain liberation from a potential rebirth in the lower realms. Here too, in terms of the whole of samsara, by adding in the higher realms, one has come to recognize how suffering pervades samsara in its entirety, giving rise to a determined attitude to abandon the origins of suffering and to gain liberation, to generate the determined attitude to emerge from the sufferings of samsara. That's the intermediate scope. And then what we will come to is based on all this preliminary training, applying that understanding to others, and thereby giving rise to great compassion and bodhicitta, wanting to lead all beings to freedom from suffering. So this is how the Lamrim is, the Lamrim, or in English, the graduated stages to train one's mind in order to gain enlightenment. This is how the Lamrim is laid out. You come to recognize that there's nothing within samsara that has any abiding value. One meditates on suffering. And one meditates on suffering in a wide variety of ways. Hence we had the threefold, sixfold, eightfold presentation. So here one really does need to go deep to challenge what we currently do not perceive as being naturally subject to suffering. Because on a superficial level, we recognize no one wants to suffer, and we recognize what suffering is. We think of illness, pain, physical pain, mental unhappiness, and so forth. This is easy to recognize, easy to reject. That is not the level of realization required to transform our way of thinking. The area of focus the area we need to apply our attention, our focus, is our attachment for the pleasures of samsara. And the pleasures of samsara refers to whatever draws us. So this can be in terms of intimate relations, it can be in terms of friendships, it can be in terms of possessions, it can be in terms of prestige, reputation, and so forth. It is very broad. But we need to look at the mind of attachment, so that's being drawn towards something. Our desires, our wants, and this includes what entertains us, distracts us, these things that we find pleasurable. So hopefully how I've said it will make it clear that this is very broad. But it comes down to, in terms of the mind being drawn towards something. There we look at various components. We look at what we are drawn to, and we look at it through two lenses. It's impermanence. So therefore, whatever we hope to gain from it will not last. And that what we are drawn towards, this mind of attachment, is exaggerating the good qualities. Hence we are drawn to it. So we need to intentionally look at what we are drawn to in a more balanced way, to recognize its faults, and to recognize the faults in a balanced way, to see them as strong or minor, depending on the situation, but in a true or balanced perspective. So in terms of what we are drawn to, we look at it in relation to impermanence, as well as to try and see the faults of what we desire, so to gain a more balanced perspective. So here I want to emphasize something, because this is important to understand, both in relation to material possessions, but also in relation to relationships. Again, whether intimate relationship, friends, whatever. It's not about rejecting others. It's not about rejecting material things. It's about relating to others, material possessions, in a balanced way, to see things as they are, not with the exaggeration that comes from the afflictions. So this is how we use our wisdom on this conventional way, our wisdom or our intelligence, to recognize the role of the mind in terms of attachment. Whatever we are drawn to, we're exaggerating, one, its permanence, and two, that it can fulfill our desires because we're seeing it in this exaggerated way. So here we need to, again, I want to emphasize this point. We need to recognize the benefits of harmonious relationships with others, not reject others, possessions, people, and so forth. Benefits of having balanced relationships with the material world and with other people. But having balanced relationships means seeing through the unrealistic expectations of happiness that comes through the mind of attachment. The mind of attachment exaggerates the qualities of something, the good qualities, the desirable qualities. And therefore, we have unrealistic expectations of happiness. Again, from relationships as well, interpersonal relationships, as well as with possessions. So here what we are trying to do is develop our wisdom. To the extent we do, our attachment is reduced. This gives us a far more peaceful mind. And this more spacious mind, more peaceful mind, is required to cultivate further qualities of the Dharma, such as generating actual definite emergence, and the various qualities that are required to actually attain liberation. We will not be able to generate definite emergence and the various mental qualities required to attain liberation if we keep being drawn by the delights of samsara, because to the extent they dominate our mind, it is because we believe happiness will be found there. That is contrary to the mind seeking liberation. So what it comes down to is to recognize how everything that has come about independent on karma that is contaminated by the afflictions has no abiding value. And what is to be rejected is the mind of attachment for them. Not other people, not the possessions and the material things that are required to sustain life and sustain life at a level of comfort that is required. What is to be rejected or renounced is that affliction of attachment. So this is where we need to place our attention, to recognize that samsara has no abiding value. Not on the superficial level. That's easy to recognize. This is the level of deception, the level that has kept us bound in samsara for so long. To develop definite emergence, what needs to be done is we need to abandon our attachment. And our attachment for the literal word term is the objects of samsara. But that means, so what that means is anything that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma. So this will relate to, again, things that were mentioned before: material possessions, material objects, relationships with others, as well as qualities such as reputation and so forth. All of this we need to look at with clear eyes, coming to recognize how our attachment serves the function of exaggerating perceived good qualities in whatever it is we are attached to. So when it's said that we need to recognize that there's no abiding value to be found in samsara, what it means is that these various objects of samsara, material things, relationships, and so forth, there is no happiness to be found within their attainment. There is no lasting happiness to be found there. There's nothing, therefore, worth striving wholeheartedly for. The problem with not dealing with this attachment is that our wish for liberation will be mere words. Why? Because we are not seeking liberation from samsara. We are actually seeking the delights of samsara. Praise from others, interactions with others, possessions. seeing this as something worth striving for. An illustration of the kind of attitude that you develop. Let's say as an adult, you develop a food allergy. You go, you get examined, and you try a few things, and that you identify eventually what the food type is that you have developed an allergy towards. And presumably it's something that you really enjoy, hence you eat it, and now you can't anymore. Recognizing, when you really recognize that that food type is what is causing this pain, you'll reject it. And you will not go near it again. You'll read the label of ingredients and you'll take care, because you've experienced in a manifest manner the suffering that comes from eating that. And your attachment for that food will be gone. You will see it and you won't be drawn towards it at all. Initially, you may be reject it, have an aversion, but soon that will pass. And that food type that previously drew you in will be sitting on the table and will do nothing for you because it's lost its attraction. In other words, you have no attachment for it. The mind is not exaggerating its qualities. This is what we're looking for. And it comes about in our context here, through meditating, one, on impermanence, and two, on the faults of whatever it is that we desire, to gain a more balanced perspective of what we desire. But again, I want to emphasize the point I mentioned twice in the previous segment. We are rejecting the afflictions in our own mind, in particular that of attachment. And attachment with all its levels of subtlety, that is what we are rejecting. The fault is not in other people. It's not in material possessions. The fault is in the mind of attachment, this deluded, afflicted mind of attachment. It is that we are seeking to abandon. And I'm emphasizing this point because it's all too possible for us to develop, through unskillful meditation, a rejection towards other people. This is not the idea. We should not see those that we dislike as the problem, nor should we see those we are drawn towards, we are attached to, as the problem. That is not the case. Our goal is to engage in the actual trainings of a bodhisattva, and these are the preliminaries, which means, as a bodhisattva, all beings are held dear. And if all beings are held dear, you can't reject those that you dislike. You can't reject those that you have attachment for. Rather, you recognize the problem is merely or solely with my attachment, with my way of thinking. And it's this affliction that needs to be abandoned. Oh yeah, then thank you. Then we can conclude there for tonight. Thank you very much.